Okay, talking about the Chinese financial system here on the last day of class has a couple of purposes. First, the Chinese financial system now is the second largest financial system in the world, right? So if we're going to really understand global finance, we have to understand the Chinese system. But I think there's a couple of other reasons why it's important to kind of talk about China in the last couple of days. First, it's a way to kind of recap a lot of the themes that we've talked about in this class, right? So you're going to see a lot of the themes that we've talked about before show up here when we talk about China. And then finally, China is a much different system than the US has, right? A much different system. And so it is really interesting to understand another country's financial system so that we get some kind of comparison and contrast with the US system. I think my hope is that at the end of this day, not only will we understand China better, but hopefully we'll get some insight into the US financial system, which makes much, much different choices about things, right? About things. So anyway, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Because I'm going to show you some pictures and whatever, I actually put together a PowerPoint for this. So I know that's unusual for me. I usually don't like PowerPoints, but we're going to do a PowerPoint today. So I'm going to pull down the screen and we might turn off the lights and then I'll just kind of work through the PowerPoint. Okay? Screen down. Putting you guys to sleep. Can everybody, let's fire up the PowerPoint, make sure that everybody. What's going on here? Hold on, we got the dreaded spinning circle. That's a little worrisome. Okay, shoot. Something is really working weird here. Hold on one moment. Okay, Rose or Xiao, can you tell me, are you able to see the PowerPoint? I think.
No, I can't see it.
Oh, I don't know. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. Okay, I think this is working, right? This is really weird. Why is it not showing the? Okay, that's really big. All right. Something is unusual happening in the syncing between Zoom and PowerPoint and up here. But anyway, all right. So let's talk to the Chinese financial system. I give this like a little title, right? A house of cards with Chinese characteristics, which is a bit of a play on Deng Xiaoping, who said that that China's economic system was socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? And so, you know, the Chinese financial system is definitely unique to China, right? You know, no other country, I think, could have a financial system quite like the quite like China. And in part because of Chinese history, but also because of Chinese size, right? And also because of the unusual setup of the Chinese economy that we'll talk about here a little bit. So just to start, if you go to Shanghai, and Shanghai is kind of the financial capital of China, and you go and you see on the Bund, all right, well, I'll show you a picture of the Bund, but the Bund is kind of, there's a river that goes through Shanghai, and that's kind of the traditional center of Shanghai. And right on the Bund, they have this bull, right? And if, for some of you who travel in New York, this bull might look familiar. It looks like the bull that's on Wall Street, right? It's essentially modeled after the bull that's on Wall Street. The big difference is that this is probably about 2 or 3 times the size of the bull that's on Wall Street, right? And so there's like a little symbolism here. is that China really kind of sees itself as a financial capital, only bigger, right? Only bigger. And so today, gosh, this is horrible. Okay, what am I going to do here? Sorry, nothing is working. All right, let's try this. I won't even start the slideshow. I'll just kind of. Okay, we'll just try to do it this way. Okay. So if you look at the Chinese financial system, China accounts for nearly a third of all the financial assets in the world now. It holds about 60% of the world's foreign reserves. A lot of those are in dollars, as we talked about yesterday. And the big four Chinese banks are amongst the biggest banks in the world. And by the big four, we mean these four banks. The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, right? Industrial Commercial Bank of China. ICBC, or often called Ikki-Bikki. I don't know why, but Ikki-Bikki. The Chinese Construction Bank, CCB. The Agricultural Bank of China, ABC. And then the Bank of China, BOC. Don't confuse the Bank of China with the People's Bank of China. The People's Bank of China is the central bank. Okay, so there's a Bank of China and a People's Bank of China. So that's a little confusing. All right, and so just to give you some idea of how big these banks are, you can really see that these are the four biggest banks in the world right now, with Ikki-Bikki being number one, the Chinese Construction Bank, the Agricultural Bank of China, and then the Bank of China, right? It being the four biggest banks in the world. Down here, you can see JP Morgan Chase, which is the largest US bank, right? That's probably about 2/3 of the size of Ikki-Bikki, right? It's just to give you some rough idea. So, obviously, these banks are huge, right? Absolutely huge. So if you go to Shanghai, and I encourage all of you to think about next year, assuming that the COVID will let us to join the trip to China, because it really is a fantastic trip. In the past, I don't know exactly, we kind of change the schedule a little bit every time, but in the past, we've usually spent at least half of our time, or maybe a little bit more than half of our time in Shanghai. That's kind of our home base. That's where the people that I work with are. That's where I kind of have a lot of contacts. We spend a lot of time in Shanghai. And then usually we end the trip by going to Beijing for a couple of days. And then in the middle, we usually try to go out west someplace, right? So to the more rural, agricultural, poorer part of China. So, but we definitely spent some time in Shanghai. And when you go to Shanghai, there's the Bund, right? The river. And on the one side, you kind of see the old traditional center of Shanghai, built by the British. And here you can kind of see the Ikki-Bikki Bank, and I think that's the Bank of China, and that's the Chinese Construction Bank. And they're all kind of lined up here on a row, right along the Bund. And then if you look across the Bund, right, you see Pudong, which is the more modern part of Shanghai. And so these are some of the biggest skyscrapers in the world. And just to give you it's always interesting to me, I go back every 2 years and been going back every 2 years for about 15 or 20 years now, just how much growth there is. In 1980, that was just basically a field, right? So you think about 40 years ago, there was nothing there. There was a water buffalo, right, wandering around. And now you see this kind of amazing skyline. If you go at night, right, you take a river cruise, right, you see this kind of futuristic skyline. These pictures aren't doing it much justice, but it's pretty amazing, right? And so it's really a testament to the incredible economic and financial development that China's gone through here over the last 40 years or so. So how did China do this, right? How did China become the economic power and the financial power? Well, when you think about the Chinese system, right, there's a couple of basic tenets that are important to understand that really make it distinctive from the US system, right? And so the first is China really follows what's often called the Asian model of development. Why the Asian model? Well, because a number of Asian countries have followed these same basic goals, though I would say in much different ways than China has. But when you hear the words Asian model, what usually pops into your mind? Export promotion, right? We talked about this a little bit. Was it yesterday? Or maybe it was Friday, can't remember. But this idea that how do you get rich? You have to begin to increase your technology and your human capital. And so how do we do that? We focus on industries in which we make goods for foreigners. And we attract their capital, we attract foreign capital, and we attract foreign technology. And we learn how to use that capital and learn how to use that technology. And then we kind of move up the technology ladder, right? We get better and better and better and better at things until hopefully one day we will be a developed country, right? That we will have hit the technology frontier. And so export promotion has been a crucial part of the development strategy of a lot of Asian economies, right? Trying to find industries where there's a market for the goods that we have, and the goods themselves are goods that we can begin to, kind of start at low level of technology and work our way up to higher levels of technology, right? How do we promote exports? Keeping undervalued exchange rates, which we talked about yesterday, right? China has less today, but for a great deal of the last 40 years, purposely chosen to try to achieve undervalued exchange rates. Very, very high levels of investment and very, very high levels of savings, right? There's a lot of the policy in China is really, at least traditionally, has been to discourage consumption and encourage savings, because that savings then can be marshaled into investing in big projects. Managing capital inflows, we'll talk about this, right? Capital cannot flow freely into China, right? It can flow somewhat freely into Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is kind of part of China, but it's not exactly, right? It's one country, two systems, as China likes to say. But to what extent Hong Kong will be two systems in the future is a real open question. And how exactly capital is going to flow into China in the future is also a very open question we're going to get to in a minute. And then bank-led financial development. These banks do the vast majority of the finance. So the stock market, yes, there's a stock market. Do most people invest in it? Occasionally, but most people think that the stock market is rigged, and they're probably right? I mean, first off, remember, the government owns most of the big businesses, or at least significant partners in most of the big businesses in China. So, to what extent that you're actually buying something when you buy a share of stock is a real open question. And so the stock market is, I would say, a very, very risky proposition. The bond market is very underdeveloped. And so there's really not a lot of, at least until recently, until Ant, which you all read about, there really hasn't been a lot of options for formal finance other than going through one of the banks, and that basically means the big banks. Okay, sorry, because I can't run the slideshow, there's going to be little weird things up here. But it should say click to add title. But almost as important as the export promotion is just the communist system, right? The Chinese system. I don't know if I should even call it communist, because it's not. But the Communist Party's unchallenged control over banks and financial markets is absolutely crucial to understanding what's going on in China, right? More important than profits is control. And there's nothing that the Chinese Communist Party does that ever makes you question that, right? More important than profits or growth is control. And so, you know, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with Chinese history, and you know, this is not really, we don't have the time to really get into the details, right? But if you kind of look at the broad scope of Chinese history, right, which is, you know, very, very long, right? We can argue over how long it is, but you know, a very, very long history. The history of China has really been one of instability largely, right? Where you'd have empires rise and fall. You'd have different people come and take over, and then other people, foreigners have controlled China for a long part of its history, right? Whether it was the Europeans in the early 1900s or the Manchurians in the 1800s, right? And so, you know, a lot of Chinese history is about instability, right? In this desire for stability. And so that's really how the Chinese Communist Party sells this to the Chinese public, right? Is that this is stability. This provides you safety and stability, right? There's cameras on every street corner that watch everything you do in China, right? And that would be completely unacceptable to an American, right? But to most Chinese, they accept it. Why? Well, it provides stability, right? We know that nobody's going to be doing anything, right? There's very little crime, right? We're willing to accept those kind of restrictions on our personal freedom in the interest of stability. And so that's really been the way that the Chinese government has sold their, you know, immense control in the financial system is really in the interest of stability. Let's talk about financial repression in China. And this is a phrase I've used before in class. Financial repression, meaning government control. In what ways does the government control finance? First off, as we've talked about, there are a lot of foreign capital controls, right? So you cannot just move money into and out of China as much as you can, right? Particularly to the mainland. So getting money into Hong Kong is easy, but once it's in Hong Kong, some of that money will move to China, but it's done under a very close watch of the Communist Party. And to pull that money out of the mainland usually requires permits, permission. You have to achieve certain objectives. It's not just like you can put money in and pull it out like it's a bank account, right? There are a lot of restrictions on getting money into the mainland. And so traditionally, Hong Kong has been, how would you say it? Kind of like the middleman, right, for capital flows. Capital flows into Hong Kong, which is traditionally has been much more of a free market. And then some of that, a big chunk of that money in Hong Kong then flows into mainland China, where there's much more restrictions about putting it in and taking it out. So as I said, one country, two systems, right, is how China likes to describe this. Of course, in the future, it's really unclear how much there's going to be two systems, because if you've been following the news, you know that China has been exerting more and more control over Hong Kong. And there's more and more concern that that isn't going to be one country, two systems. It's just going to be one system. There's a lot of barriers to entry in China, right? Particularly these SOEs, all right? SOEs, state-owned enterprises. So state-owned enterprises are still a big chunk of the US economy, or I'm sorry, a big chunk of the Chinese economy. And most of the big industries, including the big banks, are state-owned enterprises. While there are private investors in there, the government is the principal investor, right? So these are state-owned. And so that creates a big barrier to entry, right? In many industries, you can't really just start a new firm, right? In some you can, right? There is a growing private sector in China, and it's been growing the last 20, 30 years significantly. In fact, as we're going to talk about, most of the growth in China comes from the private sector. But that doesn't mean that the public sector, this SOE sector, isn't really important. And then finally, most of the lending in China is what we call directed lending, meaning it's really the Communist Party officials in conjunction with banking officials that make decisions on who gets loans. Okay? So politics, not always profits, drive most banking transactions. So there's a, I think this is true, but I've heard that on every banking official's desk, this is probably not true anymore, but at least in the old days, they had a black phone and a red phone. And the red phone was to talk to your local Communist Party member, right? So that was kind of the amount of I guess you would call it interference, right? Or the amount of participation that the Communist Party played in all sorts of transactions, right? From big transactions to even very little transactions. A lot of this is special interests, right? Who has power? If you have power, you get loans. And a lot of this is corruption, right? A lot of this is corruption. So there's a lot to say about corruption in China, but by most measures, China is one of the more corrupt countries in the world, right? In terms of the amount of bribes that are gotten by Chinese Communist Party members, right? And so a lot of corruption goes on in this system, right? And it still remains true that these state-owned enterprises get most of the lending, right, from the banks, right? Even though most of the growth is in private firms, it's these state-owned enterprises that get most of the lending. Just really quickly here, whoops. There's a lot of interest rate controls in China. So interest rates are not set in the free market, but they're controlled by the government. It places price floors and price ceilings on many interest rates. If you look at interest rates in China and you had calculated the real interest rate, most bank interest rates are negative interest rates, meaning that the nominal interest rate is less than in the inflation rate. So negative real interest rates, what kind of incentive does that create for people to save in a Chinese bank? None, right? Or very little, right? Very little. And so as we're going to talk about, many people don't like to save in Chinese banks because the rate of return is very low. High inflation, or maybe I should say higher inflation, right? This is part of the undervalued exchange rate that we talked about yesterday. If you maintain an undervalued exchange rate, you're going to have higher inflation. The government says inflation is about 5% a year. I don't think many people really believe that, right? Inflation is probably higher than that. I don't know how much higher, but it's probably higher than that. Banks, to try to keep inflation down, you try to keep the money multiplier low. And so one way that the government's tried to keep the money multiplier low is they've asked banks to have high required reserves. And then finally, there's a lot of, this goes back to the capital controls, but there's a lot of exchange rate controls too. Okay, so the role that the government plays in the financial system is much, much more intrusive than it is in the US or really Europe or any other financial system that you might be a little bit familiar with, right? This is very much, I guess, what you would call a dual system. It is public-private, right? The government plays a huge role, not just in owning those banks, but in regulating almost every decision that those banks make, right? And in turn, influencing almost every financial decision that's made in China. And so there's a seeming contradiction here, right? That you might have noticed, is that there's actually also a lot of financial innovation in China. But a lot of that innovation is actually driven by trying to avoid the government regulation, right? Not always being driven by improved services for customers, right? So a lot of innovation is driven by really just trying to get around being regulated or controlled by the government. So, you know, we've talked about electronic money, right? That you talked about it in Ant or WePay. I don't know if I spelled that wrong. I don't know why. It's WEI, pay, right? As you learn in your readings, Ant is basically the financial arm of Alibaba, okay? And for those of you who are not familiar with Alibaba, Alibaba, for lack of a better word or a better comparison, would essentially be Amazon and eBay, okay? If you put Amazon and eBay together, you get it and make it a Chinese version of it. That's essentially Alibaba, right? And Ant started out as essentially Alipay, right, which was the payment system associated with Alibaba, and now it has morphed into something much bigger than that. And as we're going to talk about here, there's just an article in the New York Times yesterday. Ant now looks like it's going to be the biggest IPO in history, right? So the biggest initial public offering in history is going to be Ant. WePay, well, WeChat is essentially kind of like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter all in one, all right? So if you took Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, put them all together, that's essentially WeChat, right? And so WeChat is a very, very popular social media application in China, and WePay is the kind of payment mechanism that was built into WeChat. There's a lot of trusts in China. Trusts are essentially shadow banks, for lack of a better word, right? These are financial institutions that manage money, but they're not really banks. There's a lot of peer-to-peer lending, right? Where people lend directly with each other through apps. And then there's a lot of, as I said here, there's a lot of shadow banking in China, right? Where a lot of institutions are doing lending, but they're not traditional banks. So there's a lot of innovation in China, right? There is undoubtedly a lot of innovation. Some of it is driven by profit, and some of it is driven by getting outside of government regulation, right? And so I think I've told you, this picture is really hard to see, but I mean, you know, in China, really the use of actual physical currency is surprisingly rare, right? I mean, everybody pays using their phone, and you know, the QR, you can see this here, though it's hard to see in this picture, the QR code, right? I mean, every vendor, whether it's a simple street vendor like this or a major retailer, will have a QR code, and point your phone at that and you click it, and that's how you pay for things, right? That's how you pay for things. Sometimes that's tied to a credit card, but oftentimes it's not. People are pre-depositing money. And that's really what's happening in Alipay, is that you can, through Alipay, you can get credit, like in a credit card, or you can just use Alipay like a bank, right? So yeah, in many ways, the desire to kind of get outside of the banking system has actually created more innovation in China, right? I mean, China has been much quicker to move toward all these digital payment systems. So let's talk about the Chinese banking system here. And then I want to talk about some other aspects of the Chinese financial system. So just at the highest level, some things that we have to understand about banking in China. China's got a lot of savings. Why? Well, as I said, part of this is encouraged by the government, right? The government really, through many of its policies, taxation, through the undervalued exchange rate, it really encourages people to save. But part of this is just also history, right? One of the fascinating things about going to China is, anybody that's over 70 years old has really experienced a lot of history, right? They've experienced famine during the Great Leap Forward. They've experienced the Japanese occupation. They've experienced, the Cultural Revolution. They've lived through a lot of hard times, right? And so, as some of the Americans in this room might know, if your grandparents, maybe your grandparents are not old enough. My grandparents lived through the Great Depression, and getting them to spend money was pretty damn tough, right? Once you've been through tough times, it's hard to get to spend money. And so I think a lot of Chinese, at least older Chinese, very much feel like save, right? So some of that savings would end up in the Chinese bank, right? And they do, even with low interest rates, a lot of it ends up in these Chinese banks. And what do these Chinese banks do with it? Primarily, they invest in big capital projects and they invest in the big state-owned enterprises. They don't do a lot of investing in the private sector, right? So the big four banks own about 70% of all financial assets in China. They're also the largest owners of equity in China, and they own 70% of all the bonds, right? So, I mean, these big four banks, for practical purposes, are the formal Chinese financial system, right? By formal, I mean the kind of traditional Chinese financial system. So these big banks really control the stock market. They really control the bond market. They do the vast majority of the lending in China. Does big mean that they're less risky? We've talked about this here in this class, right? One argument for having universal banking is this idea that when you're bigger, you can have more capital, you can be more diversified, and you be more stable. And if you look at the data, NPLs are non-performing loans. Okay, so this would be essentially bad loans. China claims that bad loans are less than 1% of all lending today. So at the same time that lending has tripled, they say that the number of non-performing loans has fallen quite significantly. Do we believe this? Well, one of the real difficulties about talking about the Chinese financial system is we just don't have reliable data for a lot of things. The data just is not independently collected, right? Almost all the data we get is through the Chinese government, and there's good reason to think that they don't always tell the complete truth about things. What is the truth? That's very difficult to ascertain, right? It's very difficult to ascertain. But there are reasons to think that the amount of bad lending in China is a lot bigger than what the government's reporting. These state-owned enterprises only produce about a third of GDP, but receive about 2/3 of the lending. So that seems to suggest they're getting an awful lot of loans for how profitable they are. The profit motive in lending is very weak, right? What's the big motive in lending? It's usually for political purposes, right? More so than profit. So it's almost like all of China is like one big corporation in some ways, right? That's what I mean by China Inc. This is probably very difficult to see up here, but this is from the World Bank looking at the legal systems and institutions in emerging market economies, including China, and looking at how well they rank based on, for instance, the ease of doing business. How hard is it to start a business? How hard is it to register property? All these things that are important in running a private business. Protecting investors, enforcing contracts, closing a business, and here corruption. And so it's very hard to see these numbers, but I guess the main takeaway, if you look at these numbers more, you can see it a little bit more clearly is, China doesn't really look that good relative to the rest of the world, right? I mean, China really performs roughly about the level of like Peru, right? I mean, it is not. It does not score very well in terms of the ease of doing business, right? Meaning how easy it is to open and close a business and get a business started. And one of the things that China does the worst on is corruption, right? Which we talked about. China is quite corrupt, right? Quite corrupt by almost any standard. And so, I think this is something that a lot of businesses who operate in China feel. I don't know. Maybe you won't think of this sign as it's funny as I did, but this is a police station, and here's the Chinese characters, and it's translated in English to complaints acceptance, which I thought was kind of funny because I was not clear whether it means complaints are accepted there or you bring your complaints there and then you accept that they won't be dealt with, right? Because I think that's often what happens, right? Is that, when it comes to the rule of law, what is the aim of the rule of law in China? It is to promote the power of the Chinese government, period, right? The rule of law is not to create a sense of justice or fairness like we Americans like to think our legal system promotes. That's not the aim of rule of law. The aim of rule of law is to promote and protect the power of the Communist Party. So these are the best estimates. Once again, we don't really know how accurate these are, but some of the best estimates from outside researchers, including people at the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg, et cetera, they estimate that the true amount of non-performing loans in China is probably somewhere around 10%, not 1%. That a lot of new capital into the system is equal to the total number of dividends distributed by the Chinese bank. And the reason I write this up is that almost looks like a Ponzi scheme, right? When your dividends are equal to the amount coming in, right? It doesn't appear that these banks are very profitable. In fact, maybe that's the summary I should have put here. Most of the evidence we have suggests that these banks are not very profitable. They are big, they are powerful, but they are not profitable. And we suspect that they're highly risky. They're highly leveraged. Maybe that doesn't make any difference if the Chinese government is going to protect them, right, or back them. But there's a lot of risk here, right? A lot of risk. In part because we just don't know a lot of what these banks do. Okay. All right, let's talk about a couple of other aspects of the Chinese financial system. We've talked about we talked about financial repression. Let's just talk a couple more minutes about this. Okay, Chinese banks aren't just inefficient because of decision-making. Undervalued exchange rates have traditionally kept the Chinese banking system pretty inefficient because it's really required, right, to maintain that undervalued exchange rate. It's required a lot of regulation and inefficient policy, right? So while the exchange rate is much less undervalued today than it used to be, it's still a little bit undervalued, right? How much is a little difficult to say. So, you know, a lot of this financial repression is aimed at keeping exports high. So here's a little picture just to give you some ideas of how big the foreign reserves of the Chinese government are, right? So these are the foreign reserves held by the central bank, the People's Bank of China. The People's Bank of China holds about, you know, $3.2 trillion of foreign reserves. And you can see how, right, relatively huge that is, right, relative to the rest of the world. Switzerland holds, you know, 780 billion. Japan would be the next biggest at 1.2 trillion. But, you know, China holds almost 3 times the amount of foreign reserves as China does. Whereas the US is this little bit, 44 billion, almost nothing, right? It's good to be the king. The US doesn't have to hold foreign reserves, right? They can print up as many dollars as they want. So the US is, once again, kind of the outlier here, right? Why do they have to hold foreign reserves? They don't have to worry about it, right? The dollar is the international currency. And of course, you know, most of these other countries are upset that the US holds so little foreign reserves. They would like the US to hold more foreign reserves and lend them dollars. That's what we were talking about yesterday with the currency swaps, right? But the Fed sees no reason to do it because they just think about the Fed, or they think about the US. So yeah, this is one of the unusual things about this undervalued exchange rate. Think about this. China, the relatively poor country, is lending $3.2 trillion to the US, the rich country, right? It's when you say it that way, it's an unusual situation, right? It's a very unusual situation. Why is China doing it? Well, export promotion, right? It's all about promoting exports. So this is a little factor I went to. It's hard to see up here, but these are the little squirrels from the Ice Age movie. Right? All this factory made was these squirrels. And I mean, they must have had 1 million of them. It was fascinating, right? Yeah, and you know, I mean, the productive power of China in terms of exports is really crazy. One of the places that is more, for an economist, that's really interesting to visit in China is this town called Yiwu. Right, Yiwu? Yiwu is, I don't know what you would call it, like the consumer good capital of China and maybe the world. So what they have at Yiwu is this mall, okay? But it's not really a mall for regular consumers. It's a mall for American and other foreign businesses that come and look at the goods you can buy and export back to the US, right? And so I could never wrap my mind around how big this mall was. I mean, you can see up here, they had a wing for hair ornaments, okay? And so you would see all of these shops and all of the hair ornaments that they made. And you could say, yeah, I'll buy one of those. And when you say one, they basically mean a cargo container of those, right? So you just kind of walk through and you see these aisle after aisle. This was once again, these pictures are really hard to see, but this is like consumer electronics, like radios and watches and knockoff iPhones and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, there was just wings and wings and wings and wings. When I was there, I think I walked around it for 3 hours, and I don't even know that I saw a quarter of it, right? I probably didn't. It's just immense, right? And so, yeah, you see how important exporting is to the Chinese economy, right? When you go to a place like Yiwu. And so where are all these things made? They're made all over China, right? And they're all about trying to create jobs and move up that technology ladder and, you know, become developed. But as we talked about yesterday, there is, you know, there's some cost to all this export promotion that China has done. This has definitely lowered the standards of living of typical Chinese households, right? Because it makes it more expensive to buy foreign goods. It creates inflation. And China's tried to damp that down, as I said, by reducing the money multiplier. They've set high required reserves, and they require banks to hold a lot of excess reserves. But, you know, they get higher inflation, and that inflation eats away at people's wages, and it eats away at their wealth. And also, to enhance the profitability of banks, the government imposes these interest rate ceilings. And what's generally true, it's a little bit less true today than it has been in the past, but nominal interest rates are really at or less than inflation rates, meaning that the real interest rate is less than 0. So that's great if you're a borrower, but that really stinks if you're a saver, right? And so, you know, while Chinese people save, they really get very little return for their savings in general, at least putting it in banks. They get very little return for their savings. If you're a saver in China, there is a lot of risk. And we're going to come back and talk about this here in a minute. There's a lot of risk because there's not really very many good options to save your money, right? And it's very hard to get diversified, right? There's just not, you know, there isn't really a mutual fund system in China that's developed enough so that the average Chinese citizen can just put their money in a mutual fund and not worry about it. In part, there's no mutual funds because what is the mutual fund going to buy, right? Stock market, pretty risky. Bond market largely doesn't exist. The banks control both of them anyway. So, you know, there's just not the kind of diversified financial system that, you know, we have come to enjoy in the US. So if people don't have a stock market and they don't have a bond market and banks pay negative interest rates, where do you save your money? So yes, we're going to talk about that in a minute, right? Some people save their money by basically lending it to their neighbors or lending it to other people through the underground market. And so that's absolutely how some people save their money. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But for people who don't want to get involved in underground lending, what's your other option? Real estate, largely real estate. And so, you know, this is really kind of fueled what looks pretty clearly to be an asset bubble in China. So we've talked in this class that how whenever you have a lot of liquidity and easy credit, and then there's a lot of speculation and lack of transparency, right? So in other words, when the money is sloshing around and there's not very much information, that's when you tend to get asset bubbles. And that tends to happen in China, right? That tends to happen in China. Let me just kind of talk about a couple of the asset bubbles. One of the asset bubbles is really in public investment, okay? Meaning the government spends money on public investments that is just hard as an American to wrap your mind around. I mean, it is just hard. This is the second biggest train station in Shanghai. Look how massive this thing is. You just can't believe it. In December, for the first time, I flew into the new Beijing airport, right? Which I think is now the biggest airport in the world, or it will be. So when did it, do you know when it opened up officially?
Last year.
Yeah, right, sometime last year. So when we were there in December, it had only been open up a month or a couple months. This thing is just astonishing how big it was. And even more than the airport itself, they had basically built a 6-lane elevated highway from the airport into Beijing, which is about 30 miles, okay? A 6-lane elevated highway, 30 miles. And there's almost nobody on the highway because the airport is not really being used very intensively right now, right? It's just starting up. And so you begin to think about the money that would take. Like, at some point I did some research that, you know, to build like a mile of an elevated highway, well, what was it in Boston? They built that, not an elevated highway, but they built that tunnel underneath Boston, which is like 6 miles and cost like $6 trillion, right? So, I mean, it's hard to imagine how much this would have cost to build in the US. Now, the Chinese government doesn't have all the costs that the US does because they can kind of do what they want in terms of acquiring land and things like that. But yeah, you know, the amount of public investment sometimes just can shock you. Particularly when you see some of this stuff and then you go to some people's house and you see how many people live, which is really living at the edge of extreme poverty, right? I mean, while China has been able to move more than 400 million people out of extreme poverty, right? That is a huge number. That's a population more than the United States that they've moved out of extreme poverty over the last 30 years. But still, there's a lot of people operating at relatively low levels of income. So at the same time that China builds all these, you know, luxurious public investment projects, you know, how actual people live is pretty, or at least for a lot of people, is pretty low. As Gao Minghao said, a lot of people put their money in their houses, right? And so almost certainly there is some sort of real estate bubble in China, right? Now, when will this pop? It's hard to say because money just keeps on flowing in and flowing in. But if you look in the top 4 cities, right, the biggest cities in China, prices rise anywhere from between 20 to 30% a year. The next 31 cities in China, between 0 and 10% a year. But the rest of China, there's almost no appreciation in real estate. Today, real estate contributes to more than 1/4 of GDP, of China's GDP is tied to real estate. That is a really, really big number. To give you some comparison, in the US, this number is a little bit less than 10%. So real estate is huge in China. And so what you get is in many big cities, you have kind of like ghost neighborhoods. People need to put their money in something. They think real estate's a good investment, so they build a house or they build an apartment complex. But then nobody can afford to live there, so they sit empty, right? But still, even if they sit empty, they continue to appreciate, right? So many people are fine to let their neighborhoods sit empty because there's this belief, well, as long as prices go up 20 to 30% a year, I'm good, even if I don't get any rent. The price to income ratio in Beijing is now more than 40. Think about that. 40. It would take you 40 years worth of income to pay for your apartment in Beijing. That's almost impossible to justify based on fundamentals, right? I mean, that's crazy. In the US, the typical rule of thumb is that you shouldn't buy a house that's more than 2 times or 2.5 times your income, right? So in the US, we're paying maybe 2 or 2.5 times our income to buy a house. In Beijing, 40 times, right? It's just amazing. When you go to China, every time I'm there, I just hear stories about real estate that just kind of blow my mind, right? About what people are paying for real estate, about the differences between renting and buying, right? I was told the last time I was there that to buy an apartment in Shanghai in this one neighborhood, if you would have bought and got a mortgage, the price would have been essentially, what was it? $70,000 a month. But the person was able to rent for about $10,000 a month. That doesn't make much economic sense. When you can rent so much less than you can buy, that's telling you that people are really overpaying, right? And so this kind of gets back to the ghost neighborhoods, right? People want to buy housing because they view it as an investment. They're willing to let anybody live there, or not anybody, but they're willing to let people live there very cheaply because, at least I'm getting a little bit, right? But they're really seeing the investment not as a return on your rental income. They're really seeing it as a return in the appreciation of your house. And so you're paying that much money for a house, right? These house prices better go up by 20 or 30% a year. Because if they stop doing that, a lot of people are going to be in a lot of trouble, right? And so, this is a common source of talk, right? Among Chinese people is, real estate, where can I buy? How much richer am I getting? How long will this continue? A lot of people you're really kind of trapped in the circle, right? It's got to continue, or a lot of people are going to be in trouble, even people who are skeptical about this. And then if you read The Economist, you'll find like there's all sorts of other little bubbles, asset bubbles that kind of, right, bubble out from this, right? Pigeon bubble, right? People collecting pigeons, right? And spending money on pigeons. I should have shared this with you, but there was an article in The Economist recently about people paying millions of dollars for pigeons or tiger penis, right? How there's like a big asset bubble for collecting this. One thing that's also related to this is foreign investment outflows, right? That China almost certainly has a disconnect between the limited amount of money that's coming in and the large amount of money that's flowing out, right? Because many people are desperate to try to get their money out of China because there's more diverse options. How do they do that? Usually they put the money in Hong Kong. If you can get it to Hong Kong, you can get it out, right? How much longer that continues, you don't know. But one of the things that is definitely going on in China right now is people are desperate to try to get their money to Hong Kong because they don't know how much longer Hong Kong is going to be a separate system from China, right? And so there's huge capital outflows happening in Hong Kong right now because people want to get their money out, right? They're worried about the lack of good savings options. I'll just tell you this. The housing bubble in China is actually kind of bubbled over to Iowa City, right where I live, right? So where the University of Iowa is, this number is definitely down now because of COVID and some other things. But at its high about 5 years ago, 20% of the University of Iowa student population, undergraduate population, was Chinese. 20%. And so what was happening? a lot of Chinese students were coming to Iowa City to study, and their parents would use that as an opportunity to try to get money out of China, right? So they use that to go and buy their kids an apartment or a condo or something like this. And it was actually leading to a little bit of a bubble, right? And you can actually see this in Iowa City. Probably the last 5 or 6 years, they've tripled the number of condos and luxury apartments. And strangely enough, in these luxury apartments, a lot of them are Chinese citizens, right, who are living there. And I presume, I don't know in every case, but I presume a lot of it is Chinese families trying to get their money out of China and into another, right, trying to diversify their savings a little bit. So it is a crazy system. When is it going to pop? I don't know. I mean, I've been kind of saying it's going to pop for a decade now, and it doesn't, right? So I'm just an economist. I don't know. But it's hard to look at any of the details of it and think that it's not a crazy system, right? And have to kind of question how long it's sustainable. Let's talk a little bit about what Garrett talked about a minute ago, underground lending, and then also we'll talk a little bit about this Ant article related to digital finance. So the private sector accounts for 70% of unemployment and 2/3 of growth. But for most private firms, it's really hard to get finance. Only about 20% of private firms have access to formal finance. That's roughly the number. That number is equivalent to what you see in India or Nigeria or Bangladesh. Very, very poor countries. And so where are these private firms getting money? A lot of it is through underground lending. And by the way, let me be clear. When I say underground lending, maybe that's not a good term for it because that makes it kind of seem illegal or kind of shady. No, I mean, a lot of this is just people you know, contacts, right? It's not necessarily shady. It's just the way that people do business, right? If you can't get a loan from a bank, maybe you can get a loan from your uncle or your uncle's friend or the local loan shark. And so 1/3 of all lending in the economy, and this is probably growing, it's probably bigger than that, is taking place in these underground markets. Wenzhou is a city on the east coast of China that's kind of famous as a home for this underground lending, these underground lending markets. And so you can make an argument that these underground lending markets actually are efficient, right? Because they have better information and they are avoiding these inefficient lending sinks, these interest rate ceilings. They're able to kind of get around the lack of capital by using your relationship. So it's some of these are a little bit like micro lending, right? You're less likely to default on somebody you know than somebody you don't know, and you can use that as capital. The key here is a Chinese word, guanxi, which is a little hard to translate, but it essentially means relationships, right? So in many ways, the Chinese way of doing business is much more personal and much more based on relationships than it is in Western countries like the United States, where we might kind of rely more on law and institutions. The Chinese tend to rely on who you know, who you trust. Who's done favors for you are the people that you're likely to do favors for in the future, right? So this kind of reciprocal relationship. Now, to many Westerners, this once again kind of looks like corruption. Right? It looks like quid pro quo. You do something for me and I'll do something for you. And I guess at one level it is, but at another level, it's just, you trust people you know and you trust people that you've built a relationship with. So like having long-term relationships in business is just really important in China, right? It's more important even than it is in a country like the US. Who uses these underground markets? Well, private firms SME means small, medium enterprises. So these are like smaller public firms. They do a lot of underground lending. And who are the lenders? Well, many of the lenders are just private savers. But here's the kicker. Many of the lenders are actually the state-owned enterprises and local governments. What? Yeah, think about this. This is a phenomenon that's known in China as wearing the red hat lending. Who's able to get loans from the banks? Local governments and state-owned enterprises. What do these state-owned enterprises then do? They just turn around and lend the money out to somebody else. They lend it out the back door. It comes in the front door through banks, and it gets lent out the back door to other institutions, right? It's a very unusual system and one that seems fraught with all sorts of risk, right? Because once again, decisions are being made for a whole host of reasons other than the profitability or the chance that you're going to get paid back money, right? And so nobody really understands what's going on in these underground lending markets, right? There's very little transparency, right? There's very little transparency about who's getting what from who, at what rates. And so, you know, as an outside economist, you just really have to wonder, how stable is this system, right? How stable is this system where so much of the lending in China is just really kind of it's dark, right? There's no transparency as to who's actually doing it. Into this underground lending market, which is not quite as underground, is the increase in digital finance, right? And this is really related to this article on the Ant Corporation. So right now, this is as of yesterday, New York Times reported that Ant is planning an initial public offering that will raise it about $34 billion. $34 billion, the largest IPO in history. That would make the total valuation of Ant at a little bit more than 300 billion. So that's roughly about the size of JP Morgan, right? Roughly about the size of JP Morgan, or the valuation of JP Morgan, which is the biggest, most valuable bank in the United States. So that's kind of amazing, right? That a new bank would be valued at roughly what JP Morgan is. Why do we know so much about Ant? Because a lot of this they're actually raising in Western capital markets, right? So we actually know a lot about Ant because they're going outside the Chinese financial system, right? They're going to other countries' financial systems where they have to report more information. And as you all read, I think everybody kind of picked up on this when I looked at your daily writing assignment. But Ant is really kind of like a whole bunch of things in the US pieced together. Digital payment systems like PayPal and Venmo, and it's lending like Visa and MasterCard, but they also do asset management, right? Like JP Morgan, and then they provide insurance like Berkshire Hathaway, right? So you think about a company in the US that was merged all of these things together, and you're talking about a huge conglomerate. And that's really in many ways what Ant is. And so, you know, what are the benefits of having a company like Ant? You get one-stop shopping, right? You can do all sorts of financial transactions. Then put this here. You get lots of consumer info, you get huge economies of scale, and of course, you overcome the credit rationing of those small and medium enterprises. So these are the firms that haven't really been able to get access to the financial system. They can now through things like Ant. So I won't repeat a lot of what's in the article, but it's really interesting. It's kind of fascinating that you can get on your phone and basically get a loan, right? If you need a loan to buy some inventory, you need a loan to maybe make this month's rent. It's quite fascinating. You can just do it through your phone, right? And so in many ways, the benefits of this are huge, particularly for a place like China, right? That doesn't really have a lot of lending to these small and medium enterprises. But as many of you talked about, there's some big dangers to this too, right? There's monopoly, meaning this gives Ant a lot of market power. There's the too big to fail phenomenon. I mean, how in the world could the Chinese government let an institution that big fail? I mean, Ant's got a lot of trouble, it's got a lot of power. Big brother. One of the things, Ant has got a lot of information from the government because the Chinese government collects a lot of information, but Ant is also sharing information with the Chinese government, right? And it's part of this social responsibility system. Are you all familiar with the social responsibility system in China? Maybe a little bit, right? So how to describe this? This is basically constant monitoring of everybody's life by the government, right? So in most major cities, at any crosswalk, you'll see tons of cameras. Cameras are almost always monitoring you in China. But in crosswalks, if you cross against the light, they will actually show a picture of you at the crosswalk and they'll put your name up, right? They have facial recognition systems that can basically find you whenever you jaywalk, whenever you speed, whenever you do anything. And if you get caught doing these things, it affects your social responsibility score. So your score gets hit. And if you have too low a social responsibility score, you could lose your driver's license, you could lose access to government services, you cannot get a loan. And so, the Chinese government says, well, this is the way we reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. But of course, the other way of looking at it is this is the way the Chinese government controls every aspect of your life, right? By constantly monitoring you and constantly giving you a reward or a penalty. Ant has access to a lot of that information, but Ant is also collecting a lot of that information, right? So it's just part of this big brother, right, that's existing in China where the government kind of, in some sense, is monitoring and the potential to control everything. The government will say, well, this is stability. This is, creates stability and safety. That's certainly one way to look at it, and I think a lot of Chinese people believe that, and maybe rightfully so. I'm not saying that necessarily the costs are greater than the benefits, but to Americans, this would be very worrisome, right? Because we really wonder what kind of things could the government do with this power, and this may not be the form to get into this, but we know the Chinese government is doing horrible things with some of this power, right? Including essentially running concentration camps, right? For the Uyghurs in far northwest China. So, concentration camps the size that we haven't seen since the Holocaust, right? So this is scary stuff, right? This is scary stuff. And then, of course, the other danger of Ant, and I think your article talks about this, is that there's unknown unknowns here. So much of what Ant is doing is unusual, and the government's role in it, right? That it feels there's a lot of fundamental uncertainty. Like, who knows what really this could look like in the future, right? It's obviously going to bring many good things, but maybe like the subprime crisis in the U.S., you can have too much of a good thing, right? In finance, you certainly can. Before we finish up here, because we're getting close to the end of our time, I just want to talk a little bit about the danger of a debt crisis in China, right? We don't think about China as being particularly vulnerable to a debt crisis, but a lot of people think that they are, because there's a lot of hidden debt in China. A lot of this debt is in those underground markets, right? Households, while they save a lot, they also have a lot of debt, primarily because housing is so expensive, right? So a lot of household wealth is tied up in the housing market. A lot of household debt is tied up in the housing market, which we know is pretty risky. But one of the, I think, bigger, the less understood sources of debt in China is the role of state and local governments. Okay. All right, so let's talk about this here for a minute. China's government is set up, the structure of China's government is much different than what we experience here in the US, okay? We are used to a federal system in the US. And by a federal system, I mean, some powers are reserved for the federal government, and some powers are reserved for the state and the local governments, right? And so there's kind of overlapping jurisdictions and powers. The federal government has some oversight over state and local, but there's a lot of independence between the two. That's not how the Chinese system works. Basically, state and local governments have all the power. The power of the federal government, I shouldn't say federal, the power of the central government is actually reserved for making the decisions on who runs the state and local governments. Okay, does that make sense? So the Central Communist Party picks the people who run the state and local governments. But when they're there, they have a lot of flexibility to do kind of whatever they want within reason. Their only constraint is not to do something that would make the central government mad and maybe lose their job, okay? So there's some actually advantages to this system. One of the advantages is there's a lot of experimentation in China, right? Different state and local governments do much different things, right? And so it's kind of a system that encourages a lot of experimentation. But on the flip side, it's not, basically, a lot of people, a lot of the state and local government leaders, if they want to move up through the system, they know that they have to promote growth and they have to promote really fast growth. And so what we get is a system in which a lot of state and local governments are kind of growth crazy, right? Growth crazy. I mean, trying to just build and grow as fast as they can. And so how do you encourage that? You take on debt. And so a lot of these state and local governments, right, have greatly increased the amount of debt, right? And today, the estimate is that if you look at the debt in these state and local governments, it could be more than 200% of GDP. So in other words, we think about the US as being a highly indebted country, and we don't think about China as being a highly indebted country, but it is. It is. It's just at the state and local level where it's harder to see, right? A lot of these state and local governments, what are they doing? Well, these state and local governments spend a lot of money on these state-owned enterprises. Some of these state-owned enterprises lose a lot of money, but they try to prop them up because they create jobs. Also, these state and local governments really don't have a means of collecting taxes. The tax revenue system in China is not very strong. And so if you can't collect money through taxes, the only way that you can raise money is to lease land, right? The government controls land in China. And so how do you make money for the local government? You lease it. And how are you going to lease the land? Well, you give them permits to build a lot of stuff on it, right? And so building, right? This is back to that malinvestment problem, right? This is also contributing to the housing bubble, right? Because everybody has such a big pressure to build. Okay, so I sound very negative about the Chinese financial system. I don't mean to particularly sound like, you know, I'm bad-mouthing or knocking the Chinese financial system. As I see it, I'm just an economist, right? And what do I know? No country has ever developed without having a major financial crisis. Is China going to be the exception? I don't see why it wouldn't be how it could not be an exception. Does that make any sense? In other words, no, China is going to have a financial crisis at some point, right? The laws of economics have not been suspended for China, right? And so I don't know when it's going to be. I can't tell you how bad it's going to be, you know, but I think there are a lot of things in the Chinese financial system that make you think that one day a financial crisis is going to come, right? It could be, you know, a good old traditional banking crisis, particularly associated with the underground lending markets, right? So those underground lending markets could blow up, and that could, because a lot of that money comes indirectly from banks, we could have a big banking crisis in China, where the government might be forced to spend trillions and trillions of dollars bailing these banks out. Or it could be from the popping of the asset bubble that leads to a banking crisis, right? That maybe the day will come when these housing prices don't go up by 20% a year, and a lot of people are going to default on their mortgages, right? There's going to be a lot of defaults when housing prices stop growing at 20% a year. That could also lead to a big banking crisis. There could just be a debt crisis, a sovereign debt crisis, when these state and local governments essentially borrow so much that, you know, they're unable to repay their debts, right? They simply can't lease enough land to repay their debts, and they begin to default. Will the central government bail them out? Probably, but we don't know that, right? And we don't know how that would impact the central government's ability to borrow, right? These are all things that we don't know. Could there be a currency crisis and capital flight? We talked a couple of times about what's going on with Hong Kong, right? There is a lot of money leaving China right now, right? A lot of money leaving China right now, because people are worried about their ability to move money in and out in the future through Hong Kong. And so the loss of confidence in their ability to move money in and out, coupled with, you know, maybe loss of confidence because of corruption or global instability, right? Some of these things could lead to currency crises. So the question that's open for debate is, will any of these crises happen, particularly given the nimbleness of the Chinese Communist Party, right? I mean, the Chinese Communist Party, while it is undoubtedly obsessed with control, right, and has done many things that I consider to be, I just say it, evil, also you cannot discount the intelligence and oftentimes the sheer economic good thinking that the Chinese Communist Party has employed, right? I mean, there are a lot of very smart economists at work for the Chinese government, right? And so they have shown themselves to be quite sharp and quite nimble, and in many senses, not having to worry about the ugly, messy democratic process makes policy better in China, right? I mean, it's much more nimble and in some sense more rational than it is in the US, right? One question, though, that is not open for debate: is the Chinese financial system a drag on growth in China? It is. It is. Okay? I mean, this could be a more stable, more dynamic financial system. In fact, the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of China, admits it, right? They've recently conducted a study with the World Bank, and they've argued that, yes, China needs to do the things that we've talked about: liberalize capital flows, get rid of foreign exchange limits, get rid of interest rate controls, move towards floating exchange rates, right? The economists in the central bank realize that China needs to look a little bit more like the rest of the world if they want to have a modern, developed financial system. But what does this mean? Giving up control. And that's a hard thing for the Chinese Communist Party, right? That's a hard thing. That's a very hard thing. To give you just kind of a nice little analogy, right? There was one leader of the Chinese, or the People's Bank of China, I can't remember his name now. We said that the challenge for China is that the Chinese economy is like a bird in a cage, okay? In that the bird's getting bigger, we have to increase the size of the cage, but we can't let the cage get too big or the bird will fly out, right? And that's what the Chinese government is trying to do. The bird is getting bigger, the economy is getting bigger. Can the government keep a strict control? No, they have to limit control, but they can't do it too quickly or the bird will fly out and they'll lose all control, right? And that is really what the Chinese government is doing. And to some extent, that cage looks pretty constricting, right? And particularly when it comes to the financial system, that cage looks pretty constricting. And so, you know, to me, the biggest loser from this system is really many Chinese people, right? Particularly when you move off the East Coast and the big cities and you move towards Western China and Central China and more rural China, where you see that China really is two different worlds, right? There's an East Coast China, right? There's Shanghai, who, you know, you can walk up and down the streets of Shanghai and at times you can think you're in New York City, right? I mean, it is one of the most dynamic, beautiful cities in the world. And then you go 400 miles west and you feel like you're gone back 100 years in time, right? That a lot of this still keeps standards of living low. It keeps imports rare. There's very little social safety net. Many people don't have an access to credit, and growth is much, much slower, right? And so, you know, you balance that picture of Shanghai with pictures like this you see all the time, right? Of just very, very basic rural villages where people are not, definitely people are better than they were, living at higher standards of living than they were 40 years ago, but they're not living at the kind of standards of living that you'd expect from a developed country, right? So, you know, this is a question that's I think China's always trying to wrestle with. Are they Stephen Jobs or are they Che Guevara, right? Are they the radical communists or are they the modern market-orientated Silicon Valley types, right? I mean, that's a hard one for them to balance. But I think I mentioned this quote on the first day of class. That when you think about a financial system, you have to think about a financial system as the brain of an economy, right? The brain of your economy. It acts as the coordinating mechanism that allocates capital, the lifeblood of economic activity, to its most productive uses by businesses and households. And so if you believe that, then China's economy has some brain damage, right? There's no doubt that resources are not being allocated as efficiently as they could be. And so as China slows, because they will slow as they get richer, to some extent, having an efficient financial system is even more important, right? So what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen? I always love Chinese signs with kind of like inexact translations or like kind of funny translations, right? Glass ladder rank, carefully slip, right? And sometimes I wonder if that's what the Chinese economy is doing. It is carefully slipping, right? The slip is coming, they're just trying to do it as carefully as possible. Or here's another one, be careful, exclamation point. Here's the section of dropping stones. Yeah, right? I mean, this, as I said, I think all economists, myself included, and many people in the Chinese government feel like there's a crisis coming, right? And so can China reform quickly enough to avoid a big crisis, or will they be stubborn and like all those rocks fall at once? Who knows, right? Who knows? Okay, that was a lot, right? That was a lot, but hopefully that gives you a kind of a good introduction to the Chinese economy and the Chinese financial system. So we don't need to meet this afternoon, okay? We got through everything we wanted to do, so enjoy your time. I actually will be around this afternoon. If you want to talk about anything on Zoom, you can send me an email and we can talk on Zoom. But if not, I'll just see you back here at 9 o'clock, all right, for the exam.